Welcome to the Voices of Longevity, a short-form interview series from the Institute for Successful Longevity here at Florida State University. I'm your host, Victoria Valko, ISL's Outreach Assistant, and in each episode we speak with ISL faculty affiliates to learn more about their work, perspectives, and background. Today joining us is Dr. Dawn Carr for our second episode in Season 2. Dr. Dawn Carr is the director of the Claude Center and a professor of sociology at Florida State University. Her research focuses on identifying the factors that help older adults stay healthy, active, and engaged throughout later life. Her recent work increasingly highlights how early life experiences and psychological resources influence resilience later in life. Before joining FSU in 2016, Dr. Carr conducted research at the Stanford Center on Longevity, completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the UNC Chapel Hill's Institute on Aging, and previously worked at the Scripps Gerontology Center. Welcome, and let's get started. So you actually started your academic career in music with a bachelor's degree in orchestral performance and then moved into gerontology and sociology. Could you walk us through that journey from music to aging research?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So that was not a transition that was planned, as you can imagine. When I was in college, my mother was very sick through most of college and eventually passed from cancer. And during the same time, I had a dental injury that caused a problem with the way that my muscle worked in the bottom part of my jaw. And after some extensive rehabilitation surgery, they determined it wasn't possible to repair. And so I was pretty early in my career, right after college, when they determined that there wasn't anything further to fix. And so I found I needed to go back to school and figure out something else to do. And the experience with my mother's illness, I think, was a big part of my curiosity around health and health issues. After having been a musician for years, I didn't know a lot about it. And the more I learned about it, I was really interested. So I looked into and became very interested in aging. Took a few classes and then decided it was something I wanted to pursue. So I decided I was just going to do a master's degree, and it was an applied master's, focusing on working with people living in the community. A lot of folks with that background worked in government jobs and so forth, and that sounded really interesting to me. But while I was there, they started a new PhD program called Social Gerontology, which was interdisciplinary, and I was really interested in learning more and didn't apply anywhere else. Just thought, well, I want to learn a little more about aging and gerontology, and then I ended up being the first graduate of that doctoral program, and haven't looked back since.
So you've studied and written about concepts like the third age and how societies think about later life. Mm-hmm. Looking back on your training at Miami University, your postdoc at UNC, and your time at Stanford, how did those experiences shape the kinds of questions you ask about aging today?
Yeah, so I think, as I kind of moved through my career, like most people, I asked lots of different questions over time. And I think you start with what you know, and the more you learn things, the more you kind of get pulled in. And sometimes opportunities, meeting people, learning about new things. So the third age was probably the first concept I was most drawn to. And it was really outside of what most people who study aging were thinking about at the time. And I was trained by people who are some of the most well-known, long-term care experts in the country. And I really wasn't at that time drawn to questions related to long-term care and the period of life that was like sick aging. What I was curious about is the part that came before. So that I kind of discovered was often referred to as the third age. And so what I was wondering is this a new thing? Is this a time in life that has always existed? How long does it last? And I had these curious questions about that period of what I later kind of called healthy retirement. And so my dissertation kind of wove in what is the background in terms of the policies that were implemented. How do we get to here? And so the only way we can have a period of healthy retirement is to have retirement, to have healthcare, to have financial stability in later life, to have independence in later life. And that's sort of what I started looking into, and then looked at differences across different groups, and discovered it wasn't a foregone conclusion that everyone would have a period of healthy retirement. And I was really drawn to that. And it worried me that some people would be able to live a long and healthy retirement on the one hand, and others transition from jobs directly into a period of disability and had years of disability that were unpleasant, and lived shorter lives also at the same time. So that really was what set me on the path that I'm on today. And those still drive me. And I think that's how I ended up kind of getting to the place of kind of where I am now. All the pieces are still there.
So your work looks at healthy aging over the life course, including occupational exposures, psychological resilience, and older workers. For listeners who aren't familiar with this area, how would you describe the big question that ties your research together?
Yeah, I'm not sure there is a single question that ties my research together, but I am interested in this period of healthy retirement and the factors that kind of allow some people to have a longer healthy retirement, and how do we shorten the period of unhealthy retirement. And part of that is the individual factors that people have. What do they do? And then part of that is what happens to them, things they effectively don't have much control over, like being born in the United States, for example, or choosing their parents. We don't have choices about that. So a lot of the work that I've done has really centered on those issues, trying to figure out what do people have potentially control about, where are the malleable factors, things we can change along people's trajectory. I mean, if you were born and have a difficult early life, are there things we can do to modify that trajectory? And that's how I became interested in some of these other, I'll say, inflection points, things that modify our healthy inflection points across different phases of the life course. So I, kind of going into the resilience discussion, that began with a colleague of mine who was doing her postdoc at the same time I was. And she's like, hey, I'm really curious about this concept of resilience. And she was a qualitative researcher. And she worked at Duke at the time when I was at UNC, and did 60 interviews with half Black and half white older adults, and tried to learn, what does resilience mean for these? They were all 80 and older, I think, at the time. What does that concept mean? And through that work, she's like, wouldn't it be great if we could understand this at a population level? And so I was like, well, let's explore that. And so I worked with her, and then over time, different teams of people, we developed measures to be able to do that, to be able to say, what does it look like as we move through later life? What does resilience look like? And then what things predict resilience? How does resilience shape how we move through different difficult phases? So you talked a little bit about stressful life events. This is really very interesting to me because so my mother died when she was in her 50s, and what we often see is a spouse kind of recover or not. It's normal to be sad. It's not normal to stay sad. And so one of the areas that I first looked at or was interested in was, does resilience predict that? Psychological resilience. So using large longitudinal data sets, and I've worked with the Health and Retirement Study, which is probably the most comprehensive longitudinal study that was ever developed, at least to date. There are others now, but it's been around since 1992. And so it gives you kind of this cool opportunity to look at people's changes in their life over time. And so we can look at them before something like widowhood happens, and then look at them after and see what happens. And so I was able to do that. And I discovered resilience was a key factor across a whole bunch of different events, different life events, but that being one of them. I think, what was the second issue on that one?
It was occupational exposure, psychological resilience, and older workers.
Yeah, so I'll go back to occupational exposures, which is related to older workers. I've always been interested in when people retire, how they retire, why they retire, and thinking about the unique talents that older workers often have. And that came from partially the time that I was at Stanford, where we worked with different companies who we thought were concerned about the loss of talent in the labor force. And they were actually interested in spending less money on paying for workers. And so we ended up working with some during some different events to teach them about the unique talents that older workers bring, and the consequences of losing their institutional knowledge at different environments. But there's this challenge of like, when is the right time to sort of step away? And I became interested, particularly with some early work that I did while I was there, in what kind of work environments shape that trajectory. So we discovered, in terms of cognitive function, that people who are working in more cognitively complex jobs, when they did retire, they actually didn't experience any decline. But there had been previous research showing these big declines in cognitive function when people left work. What we found was that was true, but only for the people with jobs that weren't particularly cognitively demanding. It doesn't mean it's from the cognitive demands of work per se, but those workers were the ones who were experiencing those fairly marked declines. So I became interested in better understanding that and partnered with a team of people who'd been working on these measures at the Health and Retirement Study, 10 years ago, I think. And so I'm still working with them today, and we've now released major data sets for other researchers to be able to use in that data set and others to look at occupation level factors. So we've been studying with students and different teams, not just cognitive function, but all the kinds of things, the occupational exposures people have. And we're able to go back, because they report their job history. So we're able to go back pretty far in time and see what are the job characteristics that have these persisting effects on people's brain and body, and things you can see and things you can't see. So we're even looking at biomarkers and kind of stress markers and seeing how people shape over time. So we find certain kinds of key themes, like psychosocial stress is not great, and can contribute to earlier onset of different cardiovascular and metabolic issues. And certain job factors like autonomy are protective. So we find that jobs where people have control over the skills and the activities they engage in, that they're able to actually maintain better physical and cognitive health. Again, it's not entirely because of those characteristics per se. In part, we figured that out because that seems to only be true for highly educated people in certain types of jobs. So here we find there's big differences in whether jobs are good for you or not good for you based on the kind of work you're doing and the other negative factors. So if you're in a hazardous job, those good things don't usually offset the bad things, and people still experience major setbacks.
And you've also done a lot of work on psychological resilience and how people navigate stressful life like widowhood, disability, and financial hardship.
Yeah.
What have you learned about resilience that you think is especially important for thinking about longevity and quality of life as we age?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge because it's really easy for people to sort of say, oh, you should just be resilient, or you should just pick yourself up, or you should just, be strong. And those aren't things you can easily just pick up and learn. Often our whole lives, we develop skills and abilities related to our psychological, what we often think of as psychological resources, the things we have that tell us that we can handle hard things. We have to actually experience hard things and get better at them and recover. If you don't have any, you don't have any experience navigating them, and that can often lead to real problems in adulthood. So all those years before we reach later life, that sets us up pretty significantly. And it matters. So resilience is a key issue where we find different kinds of benefits. People who are more resilient actually age more healthy. Across every metric we can look at, they have better health trajectories. It's not because they're resilient, but probably what they do with that resilience. They tend to have a whole bunch of other healthy behaviors. So part of it is people who are resilient are more likely to do things actively to make sure their life is better in a lot of cases. But the people with poor resilience aren't necessarily, they're not there because they did something wrong necessarily. They often faced major early life challenges. So I think of them as the group that we need to be thinking about. They're the group that if we can figure out how to help them, given that they have this deficiency, we can kind of uplift them and help them do a better job in terms of getting the resources they need to have a good later life. The other thing we've learned is that resilience works differently for different groups. So in terms of widowhood, resilience isn't very predictive of men's recovery, but it's strongly predictive of women's. Part of that socialization, there's the different ways in which women navigate the world are different, and part of it might be something else that we can't measure. But what we do know is that women tend to be more negatively influenced by lower levels of resilience, and women have long histories where they tend to have more mental health challenges than men do across the board. So it's probably the case that either through socialization or other factors, they are more likely to be harmed by some of these early life issues that have long-term issues for them. So learning about that helps us figure out who we need to target and who we need to pay attention to.
You've led or co-led many projects with partners like the Florida Department of Health, the Department of Elder Affairs, and the Social Security Administration, and you've testified before the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging. Can you share a specific example of a project or study where you saw your research directly influence a program, policy, or a decision that affects older adults?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard when you're a researcher to actually move the needle on policy. But I think what the best thing we can do is to get people talking about important issues. And the thing that's become most relevant is not just my work, but I don't believe in one person being a hero, right? We work in teams, and the teams I've worked with, I think, have worked really hard to put older workers and their issues on the radar of, federal policymaking in particular. And there's growing attention to older workers and their work environments and the potential for their future and their ability to remain financially stable as they move into retirement. That's been around for a long time, those discussions, but through the work that Social Security did with the research that they supported for years, which unfortunately was cut in February permanently. So that had been going on for decades with some of the best policy recommendations that were adopted collectively for the groups of researchers that were involved in those studies in guiding Social Security policymaking. Things like the information people have so they know that if you retire at 62, you receive substantially less money than if you retire at 70, which is the full retirement age. A lot of people didn't really understand that. And there were a lot of decisions that were made to kind of modify communication and factors like that helped people better understand what they were up against and the benefits, but also factors to decrease disability in later life. So I won't say any of my work has directly contributed to those policy changes, but certainly I think that the collective voices of gerontologists who've been working on these issues for years has been a key feature of what makes it to the list with federal policymaking. And when I testified in January of this past year, a lot of the discussions were focused on healthy aging in a way that they hadn't in the past. So I testified for the Senate Aging Committee, which has been around for a long time. Historically, they've focused a lot on mostly Medicare and Social Security and the Older Americans Act, all of which are very important. But unlike other special Senate committees, they don't have a direct arm of policymaking. So they collect information and then give it to the folks working on health and work and family kinds of issues. So it's been useful to raise awareness about things, but it does take additional steps to move towards moving the policy discussions forward. But Rick Scott, who this year took over when the Republicans took over control of the Senate, he took on that role as chair, and his goal has been focused on healthy aging discussions. So very interested in these issues like, psychological resilience and health behaviors. But, through those discussions, I can see that they're recognizing some really basic foundational resources that older adults need in order to make those sort of good decisions, and that not everybody has choices around personal decisions. So it's a balance of trying to make sure it's clear that as they move forward with these policies, they can't be holding people accountable for bad decision making who don't have choices to make good decisions. So I think it was a useful discussion to move the needle on kind of where the priorities lie. And I think making the case for things like the Older Americans Act that are in line with all of these issues. Volunteering is a subject I've studied a long time, and I think they are very close to passing the Older Americans Act reauthorization, hopefully this year, which has continued to kind of sit in the back burner, but it hasn't been cut. And with all the things going on, hopefully those kinds of discussions really have an impact collectively over time. But I will never say that anything I've done personally would shape policy by myself. I just believe that I've been very fortunate to work on lots of teams with lots of smart people who work together, and we incrementally have an impact by continuing to look for the best solutions and share those in the best way we can by communicating it in ways that everyone can understand. And I think that's really what I've worked hardest at with my career, is figuring out how to talk about these things to everyday people in a way that they'll understand it, especially policymakers, so that they can hear the words and understand what it means for, kind of real life situations, real life policymaking.
You've also written and spoken a lot about aging, work, resilience, and inequality. What are some of the biggest misconceptions you see about aging, especially around what older adults are capable of and what successful aging means?
Yeah, so it's important to first point out, so I worked with, when I was at Stanford, I worked pretty closely with Jack Rowe. He's one of the authors who kind of made the concept of successful aging known in, I would say, everyday life. I mean, he wasn't the one who invented the concept, but he oversaw a MacArthur committee focused on successful aging in the 80s, and then again one follow-up in the 2000s. And so I was involved in some of those meetings with him. And so we spent a lot of time actually talking about successful aging. And it's important to first point out what the limitations are of the concept. So this idea of successful is heavily criticized by lots of people for a reason, because it assumes an alternative of unsuccessful. And I think that's been at the core of what a lot of researchers who study aging, especially sociologists, have talked about, is we don't want to imply that you're responsible for your lack of success. We also know that some people are responsible for making poor decisions. So it isn't the case that we want to just absolve people of saying, well, you were born poor, so you can't do anything about it. We need to actually arm people with the resources to do something about those things and have the knowledge they need. So I guess one of the biggest things I've seen in misconceptions is either, from a research side, that we're going towards some gold standard rather than meeting people where they are and moving them from there. And I think that's what's key. Figuring out where people are when they arrive on the scene and figuring out how to move them forward to keep them in the best, sort of health they can, given where they are. And I think that often we dismiss people who don't meet a certain criterion. People have lots of amazing knowledge and experiences, and they give to the world in lots of ways. And I would say I've spent probably the most amount of time over the last 20 years talking about the important contributions older adults make. I was talking about how when I was in graduate school, a lot of people focused on long-term care and sick aging. I still think that's a really important topic. It needs lots of attention. But what I didn't care a lot about was, and I got a lot of pushback, I think 20 years ago, and it's less so now, but the important ways in which people, as they age, remain really important resources for society. They have an incredible amount to give, and we often dismiss older adults as being dependent, frail. We assume they lack ability to be useful to society, and it's a huge loss. And if you look at the demographics, that's going to prevent us from being able to have any kind of meaningful economy in the future. It's not just a matter of me saying, oh, you should like old people or something. Older adults have incredible capacities for long periods of time. And if we don't learn how to leverage their engagement in a meaningful way in society, as they have many centuries ago as key members of societies, we will not function well looking ahead. We have an enormous proportion of the population and an enormous proportion of the workforce who are going to be in older age groups. And the biggest misconception we have is that they're not useful. I don't know what that looks like, but I sure think that we need to be thinking hard about ways to maintain all of the great resources that they have in terms of their intellectual abilities and so forth. Retraining older workers to be in different careers as they move forward. People assume older workers can't learn. That's wrong. People can learn all the way up to the very end of their life. They learn differently, and we need to better understand how people can learn things. But these ideas that they're not tech savvy or not capable of learning new tasks or taking on new roles, their priorities do change. We need to take into consideration that too. As we get older, we're much more driven to leave a legacy and do things to help the next generation. That's a normal and great thing. And that's important. I mean, we want the more, if you think about it, I've got kids, the more adults who love my kids, who can help them grow and develop, the better. I think that should be the case for all of society. The more older people we have helping younger people on their path, that's just, I think, great math, So that's probably the thing I'm most passionate about.
You also study how race, gender, and class shape people's opportunities to age well. Early in your career, were there any assumptions you had about resilience or aging that changed after digging into the data and working closely with older adults?
It's an interesting question. I don't remember what my preconceptions were because I hadn't really learned about anything. I was a musician and didn't know anything about social science. I'd never taken any classes really. So in a lot of ways, when people come to graduate school and start studying things they've spent years thinking about it, I was starting from scratch. All my experiences came from personal experiences. And I spent a lot of my early life hanging out with old people. My grandmother was very old for her. She was older when my mom was born, and my mom was older, so she was in her 80s. And I hung out with all of her and her friends who were older than her in their 80s and 90s and hundreds. And that was normal for me. And they were all really healthy. So my preconceptions, if anything, were backwards compared to what most were. I thought of older people as really interesting, funny, engaging people who had, used to give me candy at church. I didn't have a lot of negative connotations. Everyone in my family lived into very late life, and I hadn't seen a lot of people who experienced major decline. And the little bit that I did, they were surrounded by family and love. And, it just wasn't like what a lot of people see. So my preconceptions were probably too positive. And I think as I dug into things, I discovered, wow, lots of people don't have this luxury. And I think it rocked my world for a little while. And figuring out all of the different ways that people don't have what I have had was really probably the thing that was most interesting and important. And it's made me more grateful for having access to the things I need to lead a good life to now, So I don't know that my research has revealed anything anyone else hasn't already known, which is people who have challenges in early life, they have more challenges as they age. And there's 10 or more years difference in life expectancy for people who are poor when they're young versus people who aren't. I think that's unfair. Well, I guess fairness is an opinion, but I think we should all have the same opportunities throughout our lives. We shouldn't be dictated our future from the time we're born. And I don't think I realized how much that was the case early on. And now I really feel like since we know that, we should be doing something to make sure there aren't those kinds of barriers.
In addition to your research, you're leading the FSU Aging Initiative, directing the Claude Pepper Center, and co-directing the ARCHI Archie Lab, while also collaborating closely with ISL and FSU Health. From your perspective, what is powerful about bringing sociologists, public health researchers, clinicians, engineers, and data scientists together around aging and longevity?
Well, I've always worked in interdisciplinary environments. I was just kind of going through all the different disciplines that I not only currently engage with, but have from the very beginning. I've always seen team science is at the core. Anyone who thinks they're individual heroes in the science of anything, I think are deluded. We rarely, if ever, see major discoveries happen from individuals. I think that we have new tools now than we've had in the past, but being able to draw on different perspectives and different skill sets and see them all as equally important to bringing things to the table is, I think, how we solve problems. I think that universities are not designed for that very well. So having an initiative that allows people to cross those barriers without consequences, I think, is key. I think universities need to really reconsider how they're structured. We've had people arguing that doing interdisciplinary work is challenging at universities forever. It's not gotten a lot better. So trying to find ways to move outside the silos that are entrenched in how people are rewarded, promoted, given opportunities in their career, I think it's going to take a lot of work. But through these initiatives, that's every single thing that you mentioned. This has been my goal, is to break down those silos so that we can find ways for people to all be equally valued and all come together around solving real problems. And in the absence of having intentional infrastructure that allows people to come together around specific issues, I don't think we'll ever be successful. And no one of us can possibly be treated as more relevant than the rest in the process. That's always been challenging at universities. We have these like big name people who get a lot of credit from their teams, and we have to, I think, stop doing that and start thinking about what are the combinations of talented people with really innovative thinking that leverage each other's knowledge to find and test great solutions, and then work to directly get them into the real lives of people who are older adults themselves now, or future older adults, or their families. And if we're not thinking about how it goes from A to B every time we sit down and do our work, I think we're missing the mark.
You're working at the intersection of research, education, and policy, and you think a lot about long-term system changes. If you imagine Florida 20 years from now, what would a truly age-friendly state look like to you, whether that's in communities, workplaces, or in health systems?
I mean, that's a really big question. I don't think that's an easy answer, and I think there are a lot of pieces. But right now, we have a really unique state. Not only do we have a lot of old people and future old people, it's just getting bigger. We have a lot of kind of barriers between the different age groups. We have intentional communities for people who are older. Lots of people come to Florida for that reason. It's like going to college and go hang out with people like you. And I think that makes it really challenging. You know, those environments, you can infuse resources for them, for that group at that stage of life, but it doesn't allow younger people to see what they have to offer. And I think if we really want to be an age-friendly state, I think we have to be figuring out ways to make sure young people and older people are working collectively as a team to have great communities. It doesn't mean getting rid of those age, segregated environments where people live together, but it means that they can't just stay there. And I think it's not about efficiency. Having a good community isn't an efficient community necessarily by itself. Yes, we need efficiencies. And I think that's been kind of the logic behind these designs. They have to be ones where there's enriching experiences, where people build social capital by leaning on each other, working together, where older people are helping young people and younger people are helping older people. And in order for that to work, we need communities that everyone can navigate easily. So a lot of times we talk about age-friendly communities as ones where people with limited abilities are able to navigate. People have limited abilities at all ages. And so we often think of that as an old person problem, but it's not. We also have environments that are kind of drawing certain age groups for financial reasons, and places where young people hang out to spend money or something like that. I think we have to move beyond the economic and the efficiency to try to really think about what it means to work together to build meaningful connections across the generations. So intergenerational environments, I think, are the direction we need to be going. We also have to be thinking not about fixing health problems once people are sick. If young people are not thinking about their future self, because they never even see old people, they're certainly not thinking about their health now. And I think a big part of what's gone wrong has been that people either assume that it's a foregone conclusion that when you're old, you're sick and everything's terrible, and they have no control over it, which again is wrong. But they also don't have healthcare environments that think of them in those ways. They don't think about 30 years from now, they're thinking about 5 years from now. We get treatments that are about keeping you alive in the immediate versus helping you thrive over the long term. So if we want a really innovative, cutting edge, age-friendly state, we have to be thinking about healthcare that is thinking about helping aging at age 5, at age 10, at age 20, those early stages when we still have the ability to change things pretty dramatically. You don't start exercising at 50 and get rid of 50 years of bad behaviors. We have to be able to take walks safely in communities throughout the life course. We have to have a culture of maintaining, good health and well-being in our work environments, in our home environments, in our communities. That's a real age-friendly community to me, not just places where people can use a wheelchair in a shop, right? That's important, but it certainly, I think, is just like way too low of a bar for where we need to be next.
And for students and young researchers who are listening and thinking, I'd love to do work like this, what advice would you give them if they're interested in careers focusing on aging, inequality, or resilience?
Well, I think that aging is like the coolest thing ever because it's so open that you can sort of get into anything. And B, it's at any stage of life, right? If you really think about aging as the process over time that as people move through the life course, I mean, people who are studying mental health in early life are still studying aging, because if you don't get teenagers to manage their mental health problems, the whole rest of their life is not going to work well, right? So I think all of us who are looking at that from that lens is, we're thinking about people in a more, long term, the long view sort of way. I think that's really helpful. And the people who are studying those early phase issues, I think a lot of people who are teenagers and in their early 20s when they go to college, they're not thinking, oh, I want to work for, take care of old people. That's not on their minds. We usually come to that over time from going into our different fields and saying, oh, I wanted to be a physical therapist and work with, sports stars. But it turns out mostly I'm helping people with joint replacement surgeries, which is the case for physical therapists. It intersects with all of our lives and in all kinds of fields. So I think it's really exciting. You can study any of these things in almost any area if you're paying attention. And if you really understand aging, you can be good at, better at any other field that you're doing. But if you want to study this area, I think there's a lot of room for being an entrepreneur, for being a person who works in federal or state policy making, for being a person who is wanting to get in a clinical environment and work one-on-one with people. You can kind of figure out your path once you're in there and saying, what are the deep questions that draw me? I happen to be probably most interested in policy related questions because I like big picture thinking. I like how everything fits together. But I find all of those pieces interesting. And I love working around people who are working at the intersection of all of these. And I've gotten to sort of redefine who I am and what I study at every stage of my career because aging is so broad. I think if you go in to learn a skill in college, we don't know if that skill's even going to be needed anymore in 5 years, 10 years. But if you learn how to think and understand the world and how all these pieces fit together, you can learn new skills at every stage and understand how they all work. But I think, if you restrict yourself to a particular area, you miss out on that. So aging is this big open lens, I think, and that's why it's interesting. And you get to figure out how can we modify things so everybody has a better outcome. I think that's the coolest job you could ever have.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. Mm-hmm. And this wraps up our episode for the Voices of Longevity. A big thank you again, and thank you for sharing your work with us. And if you'd like to learn more about the ISL and the research here happening across our network, please visit our website at isl.fsu.edu. I'm Victoria Valko. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Voices of Longevity.